Hey, do you feel different than everyone else? Well, in board games they call that asymmetry, and it's a Kickstarter stretch goal. And I've been ruminating on my ARCs review for months, but my focus kept shifting onto an analysis of asymmetry. So instead of spending 20 minutes of that video on a tangent, let's cut through the noise and discuss the 6 levels of asymmetry together.
Round 1, fight!
What is game asymmetry? So just before we get started, we need to find some even footing. Let's quickly define what asymmetry is. Asymmetry is the game's capacity to encourage and force different decisions from players by creating unique advantages or disadvantages between them. Put simply, a game with no asymmetry will have the same capabilities between players, since there are no differences between players to force unique decisions. That doesn't mean unique moves can't happen, but the game itself doesn't create an internal mechanism or motivation to do so. On the other hand, a game with high asymmetry will force players to make unique decisions from one another, due to whatever advantage or disadvantage is employed. Think about a mirror match in a fighting game. These two are exactly symmetrical with the exact same power and capabilities, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make the same choices. It just means that the capabilities between the two players are identical. But by changing the character of one of the two players, the game has created unique advantages and disadvantages, which will completely change the decision of the players by an internal game mechanism, and it is now an asymmetrical game. The thing is, board games have been using asymmetry for millennia, so I wanted to take a look at how it's developed and what kind of asymmetry exists. And it isn't always obvious. Subtle differences that exist between players still creates a form of asymmetry, as we'll shortly see. So yeah, with that groundwork placed, let's begin, and let's climb these wobbly stairs to the peak of asymmetrical games. Level 0, we're not so different, you and I. Look, we need to start at an even playing field, a game that is perfectly symmetrical. And you might think, well, just find a game without factions or player abilities or whatever, and there you go. But it's not that simple. You need a game that's even and balanced, like a katana folded 50,000 times. Perfectly symmetrical in all facets. For this, Welcome To is a truly symmetrical game between players. The core of the game is trying to make an ideal neighborhood. You fill out this sheet of paper strategically to score the most points. This singular piece of paper is your neighborhood, and how you develop it with fences, landscape, and pools, it's up to you, but the goal is to make the perfect 50s themed suburban haven. Now, the mechanism of play is utilizing these 3 separate piles of cards that let you conduct certain actions. And through these actions, you will be modifying your own personal sheet. And since each turn has 3 potential unique actions, and the utilization of each action can be entirely different, you will quickly differentiate yourself just by making one different decision than any other player. The thing is, this game is bingo with a lot more player agency, in the sense that you're all receiving the same input, but you're deciding the way to output your own little neighborhood sheet, independent of all other players. There isn't a direct mechanism to influence one another, but you're still all in competition for points. It's entirely possible that 2 players create the exact same neighborhood. You can place the same fences, you can landscape the same areas, you can build the exact same pools, and you can end up with the exact same sheet. Even the city plans, which give bonus points for people who claim first, can be claimed by multiple players during the same turn. So even those additional bonus points can be accessed by 2 or 3 or 4 players who all play the exact same game. The reality is you can even have 100 people play Welcome To, and everyone could potentially have the exact same neighborhood and the same points at the end of the game. You aren't stealing cards or abilities, or even having a different set of RNG. There isn't anything stopping someone from just going through the exact same actions, and there is no form of any asymmetry between players that forces unique decisions. The unique decisions just become natural. And for this reason, Welcome To is kind of like a mirror match in a fighting game. Yeah, sure, you could copy the exact same inputs and reach some state of equilibrium or a draw, but it's much more likely that a single difference will create a cascade of changes that dramatically changes the playstyle and strategy between each player. All it takes is one player to lean ever so slightly towards making pools, or if someone just numbers a house slightly to the left. It can completely change the outcome of the entire sheet and all the future decisions to come. In other words, Welcome to doesn't actually have asymmetry, but it's not much of a problem because all it takes is that single deviation, and that entire neighborhood plan and the strategy just changes between players. Just like how a mirror match in a fighting game will almost always deviate just because the player inputs are different, even though there isn't any asymmetry between them. So yeah, the game is perfectly symmetrical. Everyone starts at the exact same position. There aren't any unique powers. There isn't even turn order. It's just a pure, unfiltered, symmetrical game. And it's a perfect example for our base level. Mom said it's my turn. Now we're on to the first level of asymmetry, and for this we need to consider the fundamental asymmetry of most games, and that is turn order. Turn order is the plague, the Achilles heel of so many otherwise symmetrical games. It's easy to see why this kind of asymmetry is hand-waved away, but I don't really think that's fair. Since asymmetry is the result of creating unique advantages or disadvantages between players, it is absolutely applicable to turn order. Even if the game itself is balanced, the fact that an advantage or disadvantage is present is enough to make a stink. Turn order is like a fly in a bowl of soup. Yeah, you probably won't notice it, but once you bite into it, you'll realize how much something so small can make you change the way you look at it. And for this first level, I'm going to use the all-time classic of chess. The game itself is perfectly symmetrical in terms of initial board state, pieces, and objective, but once you add in turn order, it is now tainted and becomes asymmetric. And let's go into just a bit of theory. In chess, there's a general consensus that the white player who begins with the initiative has the first move advantage over the second player who plays the black pieces. And sure, you can argue back and forth that white doesn't really have that much of an advantage. And if chess is played perfectly, it's a draw game. You can even argue that high-level players try to draw when they play black and try to win when they play white. There's all kinds of points to be made, and there has been so many caffeine-fueled debates already about the merits and pros and cons of each side. But for the context of asymmetry, it doesn't really matter if the game is balanced or not. A balanced game does not mean it's symmetrical. And let me put it this way, even if the advantages and disadvantages are designed in a way to create a perfectly fair and balanced game, as long as there exist those advantages and disadvantages that are unique between players, the game is still asymmetrical. So even if you say, well, Mr. YouTuber, you're dumb, chess is balanced and you're just bad at playing black, the reality is that if you acknowledge that there is a different approach to play on black, you're agreeing that chess is asymmetrical. What matters is, does one side have potential for different strategies because they go first? Do you approach the game strategically different based on what side you're on? And the answer to that for chess is yes, absolutely. And look, I'm pathetic at chess, but it doesn't take much skill to know that each side has a different playstyle, with white usually setting the pace for the opening, while black is more responsive and has knowledge on what strategy white might be going for. From a win-loss, from which side is better perspective, it doesn't really matter for a discussion of asymmetry. What matters is that turn order is a fundamental brick in the wall that separates asymmetrical games from symmetrical. And a game like chess has books and theories and openings all discussed ad nauseum about the difference in strategy because white moves first and black moves second. There's a hefty set of literature for both black and white openings in chess and the optimal approach from either side. The existence of this theory, just the truth that there is a different strategy for each side, is full evidence that chess is asymmetrical due to the single factor of turn order. This fundamental asymmetry of turn order is the reason why there exist these countless theories and this discussion and openings for each side of the board. Chess is spatially symmetric, but the turn order adds an element of temporal asymmetry. Turn order forces different strategies between players. And that's it. I don't really care what side is stronger. I don't really care if it's a draw when you play perfectly. I only care that people will need to make different moves to play optimally because of the existence of turn order. So even if there isn't any unique chess powers or special rules that apply to one side, the game is still asymmetrical. In a way, it's beautiful. A thing as simple as turn order, an initiative, is one of the core tenets of asymmetry, which creates a whole unique theory of the game depending on what side you're playing as. And this isn't unique to chess. Other games also recognize the advantages due to turn order and use other ways to address this asymmetry. Go, for example, rewards points to the white player who goes second at the end of the game via their Comey system. When we look at the big picture, a lot of games struggle with the turn order while trying to create a balanced experience. Think about a game like Twilight Imperium, where the speaker token and the initiative of turn order is a key component of the game itself, and is meant to be a barter and chip within the game. Or games can set up some form of balance mechanism, like Radlands, where the second player begins with a full water supply relative to the first player. There can be entire encyclopedias written about the methods of mitigation for turn order, but it is a known issue, or potentially a feature, for otherwise symmetrical games. Anyways, turn order really matters a lot in games, and it is right away the fundamental base of asymmetry in thousands of board games, and whether that's something the designer addresses is besides the point. Just the existence of turn order is the strategical modifier. Even if the game is balanced, it can still be asymmetrical, and turn order is the fundamental form of asymmetry in almost all turn-based games. So yeah, don't feel bad. I think you can still call a game like chess symmetrical. It's just symmetrical from a spatial perspective, which is good enough for most people. Phew, okay, let's keep moving. Level 2. $20, I wanted a peanut. So what's after the first turn? Well, let's take a step back and talk about the setup and the asymmetry of positions and resources. And I couldn't talk about asymmetry without bringing up arcs. Arcs is new, it's hot, and like a receding hairline, arcs is revealing what the future of board games will look like. Arcs really has 3 separate levels of asymmetry that are modular, depending on what expansion you play with. But the base game, Arcs without any extras, is actually quite symmetrical. Everyone has the same number of units, the same kind of build-ins, there aren't any inherent unique character powers to jazz things up, and everything seems to be pretty symmetrical when the game begins. But is it? The thing is that Arcs has each player start at a different set of planets and gets a different set of resources with a different hand of cards every chapter. The asymmetry is really created by creating an uneven resource allocation that can sway strategies from the start of the game. For example, if I get tossed on an empath and relic starting position, I might want to aim quickly to influence and secure a primo court card. Or if I start with fuel and material, I might want to declare for Tycoon and hold on to all my resources. Or if I drew a 7 card, I might want to strategically play around, steal an initiative for a key turn. Then of course the asymmetry continues to expand as players gather new guild cards or by gaining more resources, and especially after each chapter when you get a new hand of cards. The thing is, none of this is mutually exclusive. Every player can secure the court cards, every player can get more fuel or material tokens, every player could potentially draw aggression or mobilization. There isn't anything necessarily uniquely given to one player or another. It's all communal and all fought over, or given randomly. In other words, even though the mechanics and the capabilities are all symmetrical, each player will have their own strategy based on their unique allocation of resources, their positioning, and what's available to them, which cascades into an entirely different playstyle and decision tree. The key is at the second level of asymmetry, there isn't any unique power that is inaccessible to other players. All the asymmetry can be reached by other players, but the state of the board and your own unique resources and position will encourage certain playstyles. It's kind of like being in a game of hide and seek, but everyone begins in a different part of the house. So some people will be inclined to hide in the laundry machine, other people under the bed. The base game of Arcs leans you towards a pathway that continually differentiates you throughout the game. Now, Arcs is a bit chaotic, so it's not like your game plan will last very long. Your hand, your starting resources, your first 2 planets, the first card you secure, this all matters and will guide a player throughout what they might want to accomplish. It's rather brilliant, but it does create asymmetry even in a game that outwardly seems symmetrical. And when I was playing Arcs, it felt eerily similar in the way it treated asymmetry to another massively successful game. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I had an intense feeling of deja vu towards Brass Birmingham. Arcs and Brass have a similar vibe when it comes to deciding some level of strategy based on what cards you draw and their approach for how players battle for initiative. Brass feels oddly similar in the pace and how the options feel both restricted and flexible simultaneously. The way that Brass provides you a random assortment of cards and can sway a strategy and dictate your action economy matches Arc's hand management, and they feel like mechanical siblings. Plus, Brass also subtly adjusts the initial setup of the board, which can really dictate the entire flow of your decision tree in a way that is further reflected in Arcs. Brass also differentiates players over time throughout their utilization of star and resources. You'll start to naturally gravitate to a unique playstyle as everyone moves to a specific strategy. It's a gentle, invisible hand of game design. So yeah, Arcs and Brass share the same flavor of asymmetry to me. And it's more subtle than something like unique faction powers, but more powerful than something like turn order. Both of these games use asymmetry of resources and starting positions to encourage players to think about what unique pathways they could go down, without actually shoehorning their decision making. Level 3. They call me the Pepper Mill. At level 3, we have the bread and butter of modern asymmetry, the main floor with all the water fountains, the food court, and the nice window offices. At this level, unique player abilities and powers get center stage. It doesn't matter if it's under the guise of a specific leader, faction, species, or whatever. It's the kind of asymmetry where each player has their own unique thing, but the core game remains the same for everyone. This is where players' unique abilities stack on top of a core set of rules, and add some pizzazz to the game. For this, I think a game like Dune Imperium handles it pretty evenly, like having meatballs and spaghetti at a meat and potato household. It adds a bit of new flavors while not being too wild and off-putting to the bland palates. Dune Imperium is a very standard, safe, and somewhat flavorful example of unique player abilities and powers. In Dune Imperium, each player will pick a leader that has a passive and active ability. These range from getting some extra money to drawing extra cards, to gain some extra starting resources, or messing around with things like faction influences or their power of troops. But it's all on the same scaffolding that holds up the game. But at the most complex, the game still maintains the same rules and robust structure for all players. In other words, the core parts of the game, how a turn works, what actions players can take. The flow of the game is identical for each player, but using their leader's abilities can sway their playstyle into a certain direction. For example, some characters can get some extra spice and be a bit more motivated to hit certain areas of the board, while someone who plays Kaz might go heavier on the deck building. Even with all of these unique advantages, the actual potential game actions available and the method to score points remains the same for everyone. I find this level of asymmetry to be very agreeable to the general audience. It adds enough variety and flavor to each game, and mixes up playstyles, but since you just need to know the base rules, it's easy to pick up a new character and just roll with it. And playing against other people's abilities, it isn't confusing or much of a surprise. It just all flows nicely and makes sense. It's all additive. And loads of games use this kind of asymmetry. It doesn't matter if it's a unique faction or leader or whatever. The key is that the base rules still exist, and then asymmetry from the uniquely designed whatever modifies the approach someone will play the game with. This asymmetry is stackable onto a strong base game. And even if you remove the asymmetry, there is still a functional core that could be played. And circling back to Arcs, when you add on the leaders and lore expansion, it pretty much does exactly this. The base game is the structure, and it's perfectly playable, but then you add on these stackable leader and lore abilities to each player. These leaders each have a unique setup and traits, while the lore cards add further customization and weird abilities. It's a very flexible system since picking the combination of leaders and lore is done via a draft. The actual choices of what asymmetrical powers you get is part of the overall strategy to build a combination that synergizes or denies enemies of an overwhelming combination. It's very neat, very cool, very hype. The leader and lore Arcs experience can be modified depending on how much asymmetry you like in your game, and it just stacks onto that base game we talked about without modifying any of the actual base game rules. Anyways, this level of asymmetry is generally well regarded and accepted in the gaming world. I would say it's almost become the standard for mid or heavyweight board games to incorporate some level of player asymmetry, and this is the most recognizable form of asymmetry. And of course, at this level, it does range quite a bit. A game that adds one unique power per player and a game that has multiple unique traits, passive, actives, abilities, all still fall within this level 3. For example, a super light form of level 3 asymmetry would be something like Zoo Vadis, where each player has a unique barter and chip ability. But your ability can't even be used on yourself. So your overall strategy isn't tied to your ability, but instead how well you can sell and utilize other players' abilities. It's still a level 3 form of asymmetry because if you remove all of these tokens, the game still works and functions properly. On the other hand, a game like Twilight Imperium with 25 factions, multiple passives, actives, unique technologies, unique troops, unique promissory notes, different starting planets and starting fleet would also still fall on this level 3 asymmetry because while it adds a ton atop of those base rules, there is still a functional game that exists in full even without all of this asymmetry. In other words, you could ignore all of that asymmetry, all of it, and still play a functional game. It is perfectly feasible to remove all of the faction abilities and just play the game with the same faction powers, the same flagship, the same mechs, and just roll with it because the structure of the game is still so robust. The asymmetry is all additional stuff on top of the base of the rules, which is meant to create unique advantages and disadvantages for all those unique player experiences and strategies. Now, the largest point of contention that people have with this level of asymmetry is balance. When a unique player power exists, it can give access to overwhelming strategies to some players, which just feels bad. Playing a character that feels weak can be frustrating, but so can playing someone who just feels busted and broken. You want to create a fair and balanced game, but asymmetry adds more complexity on how to create balance. So yeah, it's a bit of an art form. You need to create incentive to use characters' abilities, but you want the incentives to be even across all possible options to create what feels like a fair chance for all players. There are thousands of variations within this level of asymmetry, and it's easy to talk about 50 different games that all employ this level 3 asymmetry, as it is the most frequently used. But the key is to recognize that these specific powers or disadvantages for each player do not fundamentally change the rules of the game, but are in addition to the rule set. There'll be scenarios where it might be a little gray or a bit experimental, but for the most part, when people talk about asymmetry, they reference in this level. Level 4, Role and Goal. Here at level 4, we have games with unique roles and goals within the game itself. Now, factors like the win condition and unique player roles, this kind of asymmetry deals with the functions and objectives of each player, and how we all have to come to terms with our sometimes conflicting, sometimes mutually beneficial purposes. A fantastic example of this is the hidden trader game of Unfathomable. This game is all about trying to make it through a journey across the Atlantic on a ship, but some players are humans who want to actually cross the ocean successfully, while other players are weird fisherman hybrids who want to sink the ship into the abyss and feed their fish gods. Like Dune Imperium, each player also has a specific power and a specific item and a trader power and a one-time feed ability. All of this good stuff is still in that level 3 friendly asymmetry. But Unfathomable unlocks a higher level of asymmetry because on top of all of that stuff, the character-specific stuff, each player also has a hidden loyalty, and with the loyalty comes a specific objective and win condition. Now you have to deal with asymmetrical win conditions, and since these win conditions are at odds, each player has a completely different approach to the game. Now the goal isn't just to reach X amount of points or reach the end of the board first, but now there's asymmetry in the goal itself. Sinking the ship is a very different goal than trying to safely reach Boston. It creates an entirely new puzzle and playstyle to approach within the game. Unfathomable thrives off this form of asymmetry because the shared board state is interpreted differently depending on your loyalty. For example, if there's a few deep ones or horror on board and Mother Hydra is banging on the ship, it's an absolutely horrible state to be in as a human. And your strategy is completely different than the hidden trader who wants to watch the ship fall into the ocean, like a cat pushing a burrito bowl off the table. And then circling back to player roles, while Unfathomable forces unique strategies through loyalties and the hidden role of each player, it also has a secondary player role set by each character's trait. For example, some characters will be higher up the chain to be the captain and guide the ship through key moments, or some characters have a much higher strength and are capable of using that boiler room more often. In a way, Unfathomable perfectly demonstrates another strength of asymmetry, and that's that some players will be better at some things than others. which encourages a sense of teamwork. Players who are better at fighting monsters will be on the ship's deck blasting away, while players who are more familiar with lore can be preparing for the next nuke. Some characters can heal others, while others can use the ship allies more effectively. It all creates a functional form of teamwork by encouraging using your own asymmetrical powers. There's an uneasy sense of teamwork because at any time your captain might reveal as a secret fishman, or your strongest ally might be sabotaging all their dice rolls and skill checks. It's a great mix of teamwork and unease with everyone on the ship, and your role and goal can sometimes be at odds with each other. This form of asymmetry involves thinking of a given scenario in ways that are not as straightforward as a more traditional game, and how you decide to maximize a board state is entirely different in a game like Unfathomable, depending on where your loyalties lie and what your best function on the ship is. This role and goal type of asymmetry is found in almost all social deduction games, whether that's Avalon, Werewolf, Feed the Kraken, or my favorite of Blood on the Clocktower. The hidden role you're given completely changes your playstyle and your thought process to the game. Being on the evil team is a wholly different experience than being on the townsfolk, even though the state of the game is identical for all players. To put this all differently, there isn't just one kind of player. Each player has their own objective or goal or role in mind, and sometimes those functions are the antithesis of other players. It creates an asymmetry that's beyond just unique powers, but instead presents a new way to look at the puzzle of each game by flipping the script of what it means to succeed in the game. Level 5. Informational asymmetry. If you're a fan of my other videos, you might have noticed that we're mostly talking about pretty complicated games. But the thing is, asymmetry isn't correlated with complexity. And the reality is that a very simple game can have an insane amount of asymmetry. And that's right, here at level 5, we're talking about asymmetry of information. These games use information to create asymmetrical methods of play, which mostly falls under the domain of party games. Games you play with your non-gaming friends. These are the games that love informational asymmetry and use it to create those highly novel playing experiences between players. And it's paradoxical in a way. You'd expect more asymmetry would result in a more complex game. But it's actually fairly easy to think of an incredibly complex game where everyone has the same capabilities. Likewise, there are very simple games that have extreme levels of asymmetry. If we go back to what asymmetry is, the capacity to encourage and force different decisions from players by creating unique advantages or disadvantages, you'll realize how dramatically different the game is depending on what information you're given within these party games. When you think about codenames or wavelength or any game where there is a hint giver and hint receivers, these games give a lot of information to one player, but then restrict the output of that player to the rest of the team. In other words, the advantage is knowledge, but the disadvantage is whatever restriction exists in communication. This hint giver role is essentially a translator of information, and they have to follow the rules and restrictions that are given to them. For example, playing as the spy master in Codenames, you as a player have the asymmetrical knowledge of what word needs to be found, but you're restricted in what hint can be given in a single word and a single number. In the exact same way, a game like Wavelength has a player know exactly where the bullseye is, but needs to translate that location of the bullseye through this opposing concept card. On the other hand, as a team member, these players have limited information but act as a communal brain to translate the information into what they think the solution can be. These players have a significant disadvantage of information, but that's why it's a game and that's why it's asymmetrical. The information isn't meant to be even between all players. So yeah, when you're playing Codenames, everyone on the team has the same goal in mind, make those connections. But being the person who has to come up with the word and the number is a totally different experience than the players who have to solve the puzzle you give them. It's entirely possible that someone can be an excellent clue giver, but a terrible clue receiver. Other party games like Monikers, Poetry for Neanderthals, Taboo, the aforementioned Wavelength, they all have the same type of asymmetry where information needs to be translated to a player and then interpreted by others, which creates a highly asymmetrical game experience. The caveat is that most of these games involve teams, so the teams themselves are mostly symmetrical, so there does exist a tier of asymmetry that's still higher. Anyways, using information as a form of asymmetry is a clever way to create unique experiences between players. And party games have really utilized all kinds of translation of information mechanisms to create these fun and novel experiences. This asymmetry is actually quite high, and it really does force different ways to think about the game and how to strategize. But yet the games themselves are rather simple to learn and play. It's no different than someone playing 20 Questions or I Spy, literal toddler games. But those games are still based off the same informational based asymmetry. It's all intuitive, and it's something we're conditioned to understand as we progress through life, even though it's a highly asymmetric form of gameplay. Level 6. Rules for thee, but not for me. Okay, here we go. The ultimate level of asymmetry. This is where everyone plays their own game with their own rule set that structures the game at an individual level. The core rules of the game are all asymmetrical. It's where everyone has dramatically different actions available, dramatically different goals, and the rules are at best a scaffolding that holds up all of the asymmetry. It has everything of the lower levels, but it's created by restructuring the rules of the game uniquely for each player. I would say the best example of this kind of asymmetry is undoubtedly Root. And I've talked about Root a lot before, but I think the reason why it's such a good example is that the game itself, the core rules, the flour in this cake of asymmetry, is that the base rules are all just so generic and flavorless. The rules without any faction specific stuff is like 20 lines. The factions take these bare bones and spin them into their own crazy asymmetrical circus of funny little woodland animals. So how does this work? Well, because the core of the game is so simple, the factions themselves are the rules that create the flow for each player. In comparison to level 3, where everyone has their own unique powers on top of a communally shared rule set. This 6th level of asymmetry is that everyone has their own rules entirely, which gives them completely different, unique decision trees. For example, when you're playing as the Marquis de Cat, you're building lines of industrialization through workshops, recruiters, and your own sawmills. You have a massive board presence, and yet your action economy is limited. Your objective is to build, baby, build, until the forest is an industrial haven. On the other hand, when you're playing as the Corvid Conspiracy, you spawn from thin air and transform your troops into tricky little plots. You can move freely through the forest, but you're more of a strike force than a war machine. Your objective is to sow chaos by revealing your plots time after time. And the overlap of rules for these factions is this narrow. And sure, they have cards, they have troops, but the actual similarities are a small fraction of the total gameplay. The actual rules of these factions are on their player boards, which sets their structure and flow for each turn. And this same process applies to every single of the 10 factions, soon to be 13, and learning one won't suddenly teach you another. You really need to relearn the game every single time you pick up a new faction. Sure, some factions will fall within the same umbrella of militant or insurgent, but they don't play similarly at all. And it's truly like playing a different game, but yet everyone is on the same board. There are weaknesses to this level of asymmetry though. First, the problem with this level of asymmetry is that you get a bad mix of factions in the game and it just isn't fun. For example, a Vagabond, Lizard Cult, Corvid Conspiracy, and Otter game just isn't fun to play. There isn't enough interaction. The second major weakness is that everyone will need to learn how other factions work to enjoy the game. It's not like a game of Dune Imperium, where even if you don't fully understand other characters' powers, you can still interact and play the game properly. In Root, knowing what each faction does is key to the enjoyment of the game itself, which means you need to learn potentially 13 different games just to really have a grasp on Root. Now, to bring it all together, another game with the same level of asymmetry is Arcs with the Blighted Reach expansion. The thing is, Blighted Reach does it so much better than anything else at this tier of asymmetry. The Blighted Reach blends so many different games into something that is extremely hot. It has all that good level 3 asymmetry, through factions and unique character abilities, and all the stuff you expect. But then throughout the 3 acts of the campaign you evolve, you're going to get some crazy rules for each faction. The creation of the Commonwealth, or trying to own resource monopolies, or adding brand new cards to the action deck, or becoming a predicting soothsayer and mimic the win condition from the Bene Gesserits, or become become a judge and try to even out the score between players, or you're trying to destroy planets, or you're trying to have a giant fleet, or you're trying to steal resources as a pirate and hide your little hideout. There's so many different types of asymmetry, and each and every act introduces a boatload of this type of asymmetry. It's all variable based on what happens in the past acts, and in other words, the asymmetry of rules from Act 1 can carry to Act 2 and then change again in Act 3, and it all modifies the game and impacts each player uniquely in an organic and functional way. The sheer variety and options and potential branching pathways in the Blighted Reach asymmetry transcend any other game I can think of. And the thing is, both Root and Arcs are made by the same designer, but Root is extremely rigid in its asymmetry. It has a unique rule set for every player, but you're bound by that rule set. The way you win, the mechanism of play, it's unique for every player. But once you're locked into a faction, it's like a stone tablet. You're bound by this asymmetry, for good and bad. On the other hand, Arcs has a fluidity, a liquidity of asymmetry. The game changes constantly. The way the game operates on a per player basis changes each and every act, and some of the shifts can be complete night and day. It's like a magic river of asymmetry that carves a neat little story for each player. One moment you might be stuck as the admiral commanding the Empire fleets, but the very next you might become the pirate with a flagship who needs to pillage other players. And the thing is, the successes and failures you had as the admiral will carry on to your legacy as a pirate in a tangible, asymmetrical way, which is honestly mind-boggling when you think of all the possible combinations for 24 different fates. By the end of the game, you're more asymmetrical than Root factions, but no matter what the mix of fates is, the game just works. It's an honest game design miracle that all of the potential options of how the fates evolve and how many crazy powers and rules get tossed into the mix, that the game still holds together and is a good game. No matter what horrible Frankenstein of cards and fates exist in the Blighted Reach, it all works and ties together like a nice little bow. And Root suffers from needing a certain mix of factions to have an optimal game, but in the Blighted Reach it doesn't seem to matter. I never feel like I need to pick a certain fate to create a good mix of factions, and I felt that was a major issue in Root. Secondly, the Blighted Reach incrementally employs asymmetry throughout each act and ramps upwards as each fate evolves for the players. It's much easier to follow along at what the goals of each player are and what rules are broken and created for each player. I think it's partly because it's enticing to follow each person's personal objective, and how they're achieving it is a big part of the game's story. But I also like how when the rules do change, it prompts players to sit down and actually listen to what's going on, because there's a lot to grasp in the Blighted Reach, but it never really feels beyond comprehension, because it is all incremental. The thing is, Arcs with the Blighted Reach is also much more complicated than the core rule set of Root. Arcs does have a fundamental game that's playable and works. But the thing is that Arcs and the Blighted Reach starts to remove that scaffolding and creates a new functional base as the games progress through each act. The rules are essentially stripped away and removed and replaced like a cyborg, and creates an entirely different game once you reach that final act and your own player abilities mimic that Frankenstein monster. Arcs is fluid in its asymmetry. It creates new rules, it creates a new base, but it does take a lot of work to get to that craziness and that level. And yeah, there's a lot of rule funk, and I still reference the rulebook or check online for interactions that don't make sense. But it's the sacrifice that is required for this kind of organic rule bending, unique form of asymmetry that is pure pod racing. Ultimately, I think both Root and Arcs with the Blighted Reach share the same design philosophy, but Root's philosophy for asymmetry is rigid. Each faction is its own isolated game, its own rule set, its own victory condition, which is translated into points for understanding where each player is relative to their own success. In Arcs and the Blighted Reach, the same level of asymmetry exists, but the complexity of rules and the core system is much more prevalent. It's just that the Blighted Reach starts to remove things and replace things that creates a new scaffolding throughout each act. It's twisty and turny and carves its own river into many different branches and offers dozens of different forms of asymmetry that always feels fluid and malleable. It's a beautiful thing when asymmetry is done right, and Root is still the standard bearer for asymmetry at its conceptual limit, but I think Arcs and Blighted Reach is a monumental step forward in what asymmetrical game design can do for a game. Conclusion. So there we go, all the levels of asymmetry. And I just wanted to leave with you some of my own thoughts before you jump onto your next K-pop YouTube short binge. To me, asymmetry is a very human element of game design. It's all about creating strengths and weaknesses that are utilized and overcome. In a way, it mimics our own individualism, as it's human to have both virtues and vices. And that's why certain players will gravitate to a certain asymmetrical playstyle. In short, asymmetry lets us express and connect to a very human feeling of having personal strengths and weaknesses. There's a reason why people like to play as the defensive class or the healer class or the DPS class, because there's a certain connection that we feel with them deep down. Furthermore, asymmetry lets us fill a role that creates a team. It limits people's capabilities, but that isn't a bad thing. It gives us strengths and it gives us a chance to fulfill a purpose that other players can't do, which is a good way to connect with people and be human. But asymmetry can be ugly as well. Poor gameplay balance or a lack of enjoyability for specific roles can often lead to a death of a game. You need all aspects of asymmetry to work to really ensure everyone's having fun. That said, asymmetry is both a hurdle and tool in game design. It isn't inherently good or bad, and it can even exist without any intention of creating it. It doesn't need to be everywhere, and not every game implements asymmetry well. But most games do have some form of asymmetry, and it can be made unintentionally. It's up to the designer to use that asymmetry as a mechanic or lever to balance the game and create the optimal experience. I think as a collective, modern gamers tend to appreciate asymmetry in most game genres. It's something I think will continue to be a selling point, and I expect more designers to take the lead of publishers like Letter Games and push asymmetry to new limits, which I'm cool with. Anyways, let me know what you think about asymmetry. Got any good examples or games that handle asymmetry differently? Speaking of game design and designers, while I was editing this video, I received a message from the dude who runs Game Market West, which is an event in San Jose where indie designers get a chance to show off their creations. The next event is March 23rd with free entry, and you can see more details on their website. Anyways, I think it's a neat little idea, so even though I won't be able to attend, I hope to hear how it goes. As always, thank you for watching, and bye!